Imagine waking up in New York, Michigan, or Minnesota and the power's just gone. Not from a storm, not a cyber attack, from Canada, on purpose. Ontario's premier just threatened to cut off electricity to 1.5 million American homes in direct retaliation for Trump's 50% tariff, and says he'll do it with a smile. Not someday, this week. And this isn't a bluff. A 25% surcharge on U.S. power imports is already live. And your energy bill? It's climbing fast. This isn't politics anymore. It's economic warfare with a kill switch. And if that grid goes dark, it won't just be homes without power. It'll be the first time in U.S. history a trusted ally weaponized energy against America. Ontario Premier Doug Ford issued a threat that stunned Washington. If the U.S. raises tariffs again, he'll cut electricity exports to over 1.5 million American homes. This isn't a headline, it's a policy. Ontario already enacted a 25% surcharge on power exports to Michigan, New York, and Minnesota, spiking U.S. residential bills by $100 a month and generating up to $400,000 daily for Ontario's treasury. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Canada supplied over 27 million megawatt hours of electricity to the U.S. in 2024. That's enough to power roughly 2 million American homes for an entire year. If Ford follows through, states like Vermont and New York, who rely on Hydro-Quebec for up to 25% of their energy, could face grid instability within weeks. But Ford didn't frame it as an act of war. He blamed one person directly. This isn't about the American people. It's about President Trump. Which begs the question, has a tariff crossed the line into a national energy crisis? Ontario isn't just bluffing. It's monetizing retaliation. Premier Doug Ford's 25% electricity surcharge already impacted more than 1.5 million U.S. customers, raising daily electricity import costs by nearly $277,000. The province confirmed that this revenue would be recycled into rate relief for Ontario taxpayers, effectively transferring U.S. cash into Canadian households. Meanwhile, according to Bloomberg, U.S. regional grid operator PJM interconnection is already stretched thin, and a sudden Ontario supply cut would force northeastern states to scramble for replacements, triggering price volatility across at least 6 states. Ford's escalation follows Trump's order imposing 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, an economic gut punch to Ontario's manufacturing sector, which saw steel exports fall 19% in the first quarter of 2025, per Statistics Canada. Ford's rhetoric, "I'll do it with a smile," has shifted Ottawa's tone from caution to confrontation. But if Ford's gambit pressures Washington into backing down, what else might Canada demand next? While Ford wages battle at the border, Mark Carney is redrawing the map. The former central bank chief now leads a coalition of premiers accelerating Canada's detachment from U.S. trade reliance, starting with $48 billion in infrastructure projects announced in the first quarter of 2025. According to Reuters, this includes expanded Atlantic port terminals, new rail corridors through British Columbia, and $12.4 billion allocated to clean energy transmission across provincial borders. The strategy is clear: bypass U.S. bottlenecks and plug Canadian exports directly into global markets. As Carney told the Globe and Mail, this is about risk diversification, not retaliation. But the numbers suggest urgency, not patience. 62% of U.S. oil imports in 2024 came from Canada, roughly 4 million barrels a day. If Ottawa reorients even 20% of that volume, analysts at Oxford Economics estimate a $1.3 billion quarterly impact on U.S. refinery margins. Carney's blueprint signals something more strategic than Ford's tariff punch. It's Canada hedging against the volatility of American politics. But will the U.S. see it as self-defense or abandonment? The U.S. Canada relationship once symbolized cross-border trust, but today it's really just a transmission line away from collapse. Ontario supplies up to 2,500 megawatts to New York alone. That's about 15% of the state's imported electricity. while Quebec adds another 2,100 megawatts. If that flow is severed, northeastern grids will be forced to tap costlier and less stable alternatives. According to the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, even partial disruptions could trigger rolling outages during those summer peaks. Vermont's deal with Hydro-Québec, which covers 25% of its power needs through 2038, is now flagged for renegotiation. This is more than a diplomatic spat, it's a structural threat. Canada's electricity isn't just clean, it's predictable, renewable, and integrated. If it disappears overnight, PJM Interconnection warns that reserve margins in the Mid-Atlantic region could fall below safe thresholds. The border's not bristling with troops, but if Ontario flips the breaker, energy insecurity becomes a weapon no country is ready for. And honestly, the damage wouldn't stop at the grid. It started with steel, but now it's gasoline, groceries, and grid capacity. Trump escalated trade tensions by doubling tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%. The move immediately triggered a 9.4% drop in Canadian metal exports by mid-March, according to data from Statistics Canada. In response, Canada imposed $155 billion in retaliatory tariffs across sectors, including a targeted 25% tariff on electricity, crude oil, and agricultural exports. As of April, Bloomberg reports gasoline prices in affected U.S. states rose by 31 cents per gallon, with analysts at GasBuddy projecting a high-end estimate of a 70-cent increase if Canadian energy imports are cut entirely. Meanwhile, the aluminum-dependent U.S. auto sector is already feeling the crunch. Michigan-based suppliers have reported a 14% spike in input costs since the tariffs went into effect. And yet, Trump doubled down, threatening additional tariffs on Canadian dairy and lumber unless Ottawa enforces U.S. fentanyl policies. That kind of conditional diplomacy is raising alarms not just in Canada, but within U.S. chambers of commerce. What happens next may just redefine how supply chains and statecraft collide. Doug Ford's threat to shut off power exports to the U.S. isn't just political theater. It risks undermining a $3.6 billion annual electricity trade with American states. According to Natural Resources Canada, Ontario and Quebec together exported over 46 terawatt-hours of electricity to the U.S. in 2024, generating more revenue than all of Canada's auto parts exported to Michigan. Cutting that flow would cost Ontario millions per day and likely trigger industrial layoffs at home. But Ford argues the real crisis is already unfolding. StatsCan reports a 7.1% year-on-year drop in Ontario's manufacturing output since the 50% U.S. tariffs kicked in. Oxford Economics forecasts that if Canada retaliates fully and the U.S. responds with further escalation, Canada's GDP could contract 2.5% by early 2026. And unemployment could rise to 7.9%. It's a blunt force strategy, risk recession now to avoid economic submission later. But if Ontario's grid goes dark for U.S. customers, it won't be Ford who loses power. It'll be the governors scrambling to explain blackouts to their voters. In Michigan, about 19% of U.S. vehicle production relies on uninterrupted power to keep plants running. And that power, honestly, flows straight from Canada. Alberta's oil fuels Illinois' fourth largest refinery system, while Ontario's hydroelectricity powers everything from assembly lines in Ohio to data centers in Pennsylvania. If energy imports are cut, the result isn't just higher prices, it's basically industrial paralysis. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Canada supplies 99% of America's natural gas imports, and 62% of its crude. Bloomberg reports that U.S. Midwestern refinery margins would drop by up to 12% if Canadian crude access is restricted, while energy sec projects blackouts in New England within 6 weeks of a full electricity cutoff. Businesses are really bracing for impact. The Michigan Manufacturers Association says a 10% rise in electricity costs could wipe out $700 million in profits statewide. So while Ford plays hardball, state officials are calculating the fallout, not in megawatts, but in jobs lost and contracts broken. The trade war may have started in Ottawa and Washington, but the economic bleeding begins in Toledo, Saginaw, and Buffalo. Doug Ford's threats may sound dramatic, but analysts at RBC Capital Markets argue they're actually part of a growing global trend, energy being used as diplomatic leverage. In 2024, China rerouted liquefied natural gas away from the EU to punish political posturing over Taiwan. Russia's gas blackmail of Europe during the Ukraine conflict cost Germany 2.5% of its GDP in the third quarter of 2022. Now, Canada appears to be testing whether hydroelectricity can carry the same weight in North America. U.S. regional transmission organizations, or RTOs, aren't built for this level of sudden geopolitical volatility. According to NERC, most have less than 20% reserve capacity, and blackouts in one region could trigger price cascades nationwide. If Canada proves that even a moderate disruption can destabilize multiple grids, it might not just change how trade deals are negotiated. It could shift how energy itself is governed across borders. So ask yourself, is this retaliation, or is Canada quietly teaching the U.S. a lesson in 21st century energy warfare? Mark Carney isn't threatening to pull the plug. He's preparing Canada to never need the socket again. Under his leadership, Canada has committed $48 billion in economic restructuring to reduce dependency on U.S. trade by 28% over the next 5 years, according to the Canadian Ministry of Innovation. That includes the $7.1 billion West Coast Port Expansion Project, a $4.9 billion green hydrogen corridor in Alberta, and a federal subsidy overhaul to attract global EV manufacturers. Carney calls it future-proofing in interviews with Reuters, but critics argue it's a gamble that assumes America will remain unstable. Yet, the numbers are stacking up in his favor. Foreign direct investment in Canada surged 14.3% in the first quarter of 2025, largely from Europe and Japan, looking to bypass U.S. trade volatility. Carney's bet is that Canada can't win a tariff war. It didn't start, but it can reroute its economy before the next one begins. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. And hey, check out another video that is now on your screen.